Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. This is our first episode of 2024. Feels weird to say. So today is January 8th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. It still feels weird to say that, too. I've got a great episode for you this week, and we've got so many good ones coming up. Thanks for sticking with us throughout the holidays. I hope that you had a restful time. I hope that it wasn't too stressful for you. It is definitely a difficult time in the world right now. And, you know, coming from the field of psychology, I guess my only real hope is that you're taking care of yourself, you're taking care of your mental health, and you're doing what you can to be okay during these really, really trying times. Before we do dive into the episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. I know I say it every week, but Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. We're on our 10th year now. We actually launched in 2014, so we'll be coming up on our 10-year anniversary soon. And many of you have been with me since the launch of Patreon, which happened after the show started. So Patreon is a platform wherein you can pledge your support on an episodic basis, very similar to sort of the NPR or the PBS model here in the US for public television and public radio. Basically, what it means is that you offset the cost. You know, if you can afford to support the show, you're making it so that those who can't can still listen for free and they don't have to pay a cent. This week's top patrons and kind of ongoing include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. And of course, there are hundreds more of you who support the show in the amounts that you can. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you're interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, patreon.com/talknerdy, where you can learn more. All right, let's get into this week's episode. So I had the opportunity once again to speak with Dr. Robert M. Sapolsky. You may know him if you've ever studied psychology as the author of Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. He is a neuroendocrinologist. He is a biologist. He's the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor of Biology, Neurology, and Neurosurgery at Stanford. He is the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, and he's written several fascinating nonfiction books. Most recently, I actually had him on the show in 2017 to talk about his previous book, Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And one of the sort of theses that came out of that book was this grappling with the existence, or as he grapples with the lack of existence of free will. So his new book is a full-length grappling with that very concept. It's called Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Robert Sapolsky. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
I am excited to talk about your new book. I'm a little nervous about how this is going to go, actually, because I don't know. I'm open to a lot of the arguments that you make in your new book, but I'm also obviously a bit shaky, I guess, unsure about my personal feelings towards them. And since the last time you came on the show, which I'm just looking up, was in 2017 to talk about your last book, Behave, which is sort of, I don't know, like the precursor to the arguments that are made in this book. Since then, not only did I go back to school, but I actually finished my PhD in psychology.
Okay.
Thank you. And so I'm coming at it maybe from a slightly different place than I might have been in the past, or at least maybe one with a little bit more reading under my belt, a little bit more work that I've done on some of these topics. Although this is by no means my area of expertise. So let's talk about your area of expertise first, because I think that's an interesting sort of entree into how and why you decided to put these arguments on the page. because you're technically a neuroendocrinologist, right? Would that be the most appropriate title?
Yeah, I've spent most of my professional career in a lab doing stuff with pipettes.
And what mostly animal models would you say? Like what kind of organisms would you usually work with, or was it mostly in vitro?
Animal models, tissue culture. Every now and then we would do something or other with a human and decide that was way too messy for us.
And were you mostly looking at like nerve cell networks, or like what level of kind of resolution were you focused on throughout most of your career?
Cellular neuroscience on a certain level. I'm by background mostly interested in stress and health, and what my lab spent forever on was trying to understand the effects of stress hormones on the brain, and can summarize 40 years of work by saying the effects aren't good, and try to figure out on a cellular molecular level why exactly stress accelerates brain aging and makes you more at risk for various neuropsychiatric disorders and things like that. So initially on a whole animal level, but eventually fairly molecular.
And for many of the listeners of the show who have read some of your more crossover, like popular science books, that's probably how they know you. But for a subsection, and I would find myself included of this subsection early on, the way some people know you is because they would read your research in sort of intro psych courses or in graduate level psychology courses. Of course, I think many people know why zebras don't get ulcers, which was I guess, that was a trade publication, right? That was attempting to sort of make what you were doing in the lab, I guess, understandable for a more general audience.
Yeah, basically.
And so there's been a bit of a shift. Maybe I wouldn't call it a shift as much as a growth. Like maybe some of this previous work that you've kind of dedicated your career to was more of a foundation or a platform, I don't know, maybe some of this writing that you've taken on in the last several years has really spun out of that. But I'm super curious about that trajectory, sort of how you got into more of these conversations about that require a lot of kind of psychology and philosophy in order to make the arguments that you make.
Well, I think it kind of reflects the fact that I've always been a generalist. Over those decades of doing the lab work, amid that, every summer I would spend 3 months, and this was for more than 30 years, studying wild baboons in a national park in East Africa, trying to understand who's got the stress-related diseases and what does it have to do with their social rank and their personality and such. And I think one way of framing that is, in my lab work, I was talking a lot to molecular biologists and neurologists and things like that, whereas the field work had me talking to sociologists and economists, God help me, and things of that sort. So one way of framing that is, that gives one a perspective from a lot of different disciplines. The other way is that one is perpetually skating on thin ice of dilettantishness. But those pieces kind of combined. I stopped active research about 12 years ago. A variety of field work circumstances ended my field work after those 33 years. And the lab work, at some point you realize you had your best ideas long ago, and you kind of want to start thinking about bigger things rather than oh my God, what are we going to do about the fungal infection in the rat colony this week? Which your sense of well-being is incredibly dependent on stuff like that. And so for the last 12 years, I've been sort of trying to integrate these different bits and pieces of my interest into understanding the biology of human behavior. And the book that you allude to, I 2017 one, Behave, The Biology of Humans, Our Best and Worst, is trying to understand biology, parentheses, interacting with environment, explaining this bizarre thing about humans, which is we are the most miserably violent species on this planet. And at the same time, we're the most cooperative and potentially compassionate and altruistic. And sometimes it's the same person, and sometimes it's the same act, and it's in the eye of the beholder. And trying to tackle that. And one of the things that I thought the book was accomplishing was it was like monstrously long. It was like 800 god awful pages. And I assumed you get to the end of it sort of struggling for the finish line. And what would become clear is, among other things, free will is nonsense. Just going through all the ways in which we are the end product of the biology environment of 1 second ago, 1 year ago, a lifetime ago, a million years ago. And it seems self-evident that there's like no free will, and I haven't believed in it since I was about 14. But then I hear from all sorts of people who would basically say, "Oh, I just like made it to the end of your book." And it strikes me that this may weaken the concept of free will. And my response would be, weaken? Oh my God, there's no room for free will whatsoever. And realized that, in a sense, I needed to do a next book that was not subtle, which was saying, like, there is no free will. And what are we going to do about it? Which is the new book. And as you said, it has forced me to actually read philosophers, and I am constitutionally unable to do that with much ease or comprehend things of that sort. But trying to make the argument, as the book does, that we have no free will whatsoever, which kind of puts me out in the lunatic fringe of just how extreme of a stance one could take for sort of, we're nothing more or less than the sum of our biology. And in some ways, more importantly, arguing that if people actually started believing there's no free will, the world would be a much better place. So that's kind of the rationale for why I wrote this next book.
Ugh, I have so many questions. I'm like, there's so many things that come up in talking about this argument. And I think before we even get into the argument about free will, I have sort of a meta question that may or may not be answerable, but grappling with these bigger picture questions, sort of you mentioned before the stressors of being day to day in the lab, and I remember the stressors of getting that alert on my phone in the middle of the night that the CO2 was too low in my incubator, and like, oh, I gotta go up to the lab. And yes, and it's overwhelming, and it's also very granular. And there is this part, I think, of all of us, this existential being within us that yearns to or can't help but grapple with some of these larger questions. I myself practice existential psychotherapy, so I tend towards what we call the four givens of existence: fear of death, freedom, and determination, loneliness, and meaninglessness, and that these are like fundamental kind of human quandaries that all of us grapple with and that affect our mental health. I know that's a lot that I'm putting out there, but my question to you is, how much do you think that evolution in thought is sort of a normal aging process? Just as we age, we start to think about things in a different way and in a sort of bigger picture way. And how much of it do you think is also influenced by sort of the political, the geopolitical, the whatever word you want to use for it, the state of the world right now? Like, is now the time to be publishing this book because so many people are grappling with these issues? Or is this a timeless phenomenon, something that we will always, each new generation will have their own grapplings with?
Well, I would say timeless, which is another way of saying the book is potentially irrelevant in all sorts of domains and all sorts of times. But in terms of this being like an age-related phenomenon, there's some of that. But as I alluded to before, I haven't believed in free will since I was 14. And have been somewhat unsuccessfully grappling with the existential implications of that since then. So this is not a, becoming an old fart and exploiting your tenure to sit and think about the big picture stuff. This has kind of been something I've been mulling over forever. And when I started writing Behave like 5-6 years ago, I realized some of the notes I was using were from college, showing how like embedded this stuff is. So I think some of it is, reaching the point of life where you'd rather try to synthesize a whole bunch of things rather than like get incredibly stressed if some grad student's t-test didn't reach significance. But in terms of the relevance to this particular time, the world right now is the most screwed up it's ever been. But I've thought that at any given point, at any point in my life, and I suspect everyone has thought that it could never get worse. So the pertinence of this to like the current situation strikes me as very compelling. But yeah, things have been a mess for a long time and will be. And we will inevitably wonder how we fit into all of this in terms of meaning and what defines us. And I think I don't know, I had the luxury to sit and marinate in these thoughts for a number of years and in producing a book around now.
Yeah. When I was around the same age, 14, 15, I was raised Mormon, and that's when I sort of declared to my family that I didn't believe in God and that I was actually an atheist and I couldn't kind of continue the charade. And I think a lot of personal beliefs, philosophical kind of views were starting to become tangible to me. And I'm curious, and when people say, well, what was the thing? I'm like, there was no thing, like nothing happened. It just became more, I was able to verbalize what I think had been growing in me for some time. So I'm curious, because you point to the age of 14, which is kind of, it's very specific. Did something happen at 14? Is that just when did you write an essay? Did you grapple with this topic for some specific reason? Or is that just like a general time when you were starting to come into your own?
I could actually pinpoint it down to the night. I was raised very religiously in sort of a very orthodox setting, and it really dominated my life. And it, as I'm sure you discovered, inevitably generated all sorts of deep emotional contradictions. Like, what kind of world is this in which there's an omnipotent this or that? And some of it happened to be very personally relevant to sort of where some things were happening with me. And it was all very distressing. And how do I resolve all? And then one night I woke up at 2 a.m. and I suddenly had this like realization of, oh, I get it. There's no God. And then a few seconds later, oh, and there's no free will. And then a few seconds after that, oh, and there's no meaning. The universe is this empty, indifferent place. And everything just fell into place then. And it's been like that ever since.
Do you believe, a big part of my work is that I practice something called logotherapy. So this like meaning-centered therapy, because I work with people who are dying very often. I work with people with kind of severe cancer diagnoses. And there are different approaches to this question of meaning. I think there is a religious approach, which argues, and a religious existential approach, which argues that there is implicit or intrinsic meaning that sort of God imbued into the world, and it's our job to uncover it. I don't personally believe that, but I also don't know if, for all intents and purposes in practice, it's that different than my view, which is that there is kind of no meaning by default, by definition, and it's our job to sort of create it, to, like artists, produce meaning for ourselves. And so I'm curious if you were to sort of, I I don't expect a category, but do you see yourself as more like nihilistic, or do you see yourself as more existential in that maybe there is no meaning, but things can still be meaningful because we create meaning?
Definitely the latter, which is sort of the prerequisite for getting up in the morning. I mean, I think in some ways it touches on the difference between atheism and this newfangled term that a lot of atheists have tried to like bring into vogue, humanism. Atheism is just like what there isn't. There isn't an omnipotent source of meaning. There isn't a purpose in life that comes from something larger than us, all that sort of thing. It's mostly what isn't, and oh, what a downer, and all that atheists do is say, nah, 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 it doesn't really work that way. And humanism instead focusing on, yes, there is goodness and meaning, but humans are the source of it. And, it's a good selling gimmick, and it makes atheism seem a lot less cranky and off-putting. But it's also exactly the point you raise. They're going to have to find meaning somewhere, and all of us with our foibles and all of the ways in which we find meaning that explicitly contradict what our biology is about, if we really stop and think about it, is kind of what gets us up in the morning.
And so, that does take us to this larger thesis of your new book, Determined, which, it's right there in the title. This sort of determinism that occurs from the very beginning, I guess conception, you could even say, of like specific genes combining with other specific genes, to how all of these other factors are aligned, and we develop a certain biology, and we experience certain experiences in our life, and there are certain constructs that are normalized to us. And ultimately, we grapple with this question of, is there free will? And you came out right at the beginning with the stance that you've kind of held since you were quite young, that there is no such thing as free will. And I guess in order to grapple with that appropriately, we have to operationally define it so that we know that we're not talking past each other, right? So how do you define free will?
Well, maybe a good place to start is all the ways in which people define free will, which gets them into trouble, and concluding there's something there when there isn't, because this is most people's conventional sense. We make choices. We make choices all the time. We choose vanilla over chocolate. We choose to pull a trigger. We choose to check off whatever on a ballot box. We make choices, and they are imbued with a sense of agency. We have an intent. We know that we have the intent. We know what the likely outcome is. And probably most importantly, we know that there's alternatives available to us. And for most people and for our legal system, that's both the beginning and the end of what you need. Yeah, intent, awareness of alternatives, not coerced, aware of what the consequences would be, intact enough to understand that, and thus culpability, and they're responsible. And that makes such intuitive sense to most people that at the core, that is what their sense of free will is from. I lean forward and I pick up a pencil and I say to the person on the other side of the desk who's saying there's no such thing as free will, I say to them, are you telling me just now when I decided to pick up this pencil that I was actually just determined to do that? Because that moment is like so agentic and palpable. And the problem there is that doing that and trying to assess whether or not there's free will is like trying to assess a book by only reading its last page. Because what you're not doing with that approach is asking the only question that's reasonable, which is like, oh yeah, where did that intent come from? How did you turn out to be the sort of person who would choose vanilla ice cream at that point? How did you turn out to be the sort of person who would be standing there choosing between ice creams, having the money to buy it, that you wouldn't, any sort of alternative? How did you form that intent? And how were you formed thus into the person who would have that intent, because no matter how hard you try, you can't intend to have something different from what you intend.
Right. Right. I
And
mean,
and
go
that's
ahead.
people's conventional sense of free will is
Mhm.
built around that momentness. And, occasionally you could see where that momentness came from. Aha, a biological phenomenon. I'm not going to have any ice cream because I'm lactose intolerant. Ooh, we've got an explanation. But the trouble is, most of the time, the explanations for where that intent came from for the little things and all the big picture stuff came from 1,000 near invisible little spider web threads of causality that came before, from the moment you were conceived to 2 seconds ago. And it's really hard to detect how all that stuff is going on and how that's what's underneath the hood.
Right. So we often think of free will as volition or choice, and we often think of it as a pinpoint of time. Like we like to, um, I guess, visualize it when it comes to decision making. Like I have the will to go left or right. I have the will to go vanilla or chocolate. Um, but it's not about these moment to moment things, right? It's your argument is that it's the culmination of everything leading up to it.
Exactly. And it's a big picture. In classic studies, everybody in the is there free will or not biology business has to cite these studies by the second paragraph by a guy named Benjamin Libet in the 1980s. And only since the book was published and I'm talking about it, I realized, I don't know if it's Libet or Libet, but whatever. Um, and this was like the iconic study. You sit somebody down, there's a button there, and say, push the button whenever you feel like it. And here, in addition, we've got this clock here with a big, 3-second hand sweep. And as soon as you are intending to push the button, glance at the clock and remember what time it was. And then you wire up the person's arms to see when the muscles begin to contract to press the button. And turns out, 200 milliseconds after somebody said they formed their intent, they're starting to move their muscles, so that's fine. And then 1980s version appearing on the brain, you wire the person up, EEGs, electroencephalograms, and there's a distinctive waveform pattern that you could see when your motor cortex has intended to do something. And the thing that just floored everyone was, oh my God, you could detect that signal 300 milliseconds before someone claimed they were consciously aware of that intent. Ooh, your brain decided before you did. There's no free will. Subsequent studies using fancier brain imaging shows that you can pick up that signal 5 seconds before in other brain areas. Wow, and big surprise, everybody's been fighting over that ever since, as to whether it actually means that. Is there a difference between intent and awareness of intent? Is there a difference between intent and an urge? And people, 40 years later, they're still yelling at each other about this. And again, my stance is this is fascinating science, but it's completely irrelevant to the free will issue, because it's not addressing and where did that intent come from? And in this case, it's not just how do you become the sort of person who would press that button at that point, which is pretty narrow and not terribly interesting, but how circumstances produce you as someone who could go to a university and who had an interest in psychology and who would have the mixture of altruism and curiosity to sign up for a psych experiment, and the executive function to actually show up on time, and to not have this sort of personality where you're trying to prove to the researchers you're smarter than them, so you're intentionally screwing up your answers. Instead, how do you wind up with a temperament where you wanted to sincerely follow them? And why didn't you turn out to be the sort of person where you came into the lab and you saw they were all busy with the previous test subject and you steal somebody's laptop and run out? Why didn't you turn into that sort of person? How did you wind up being the sort of person who in that instant would be in this circumstance and decide to push that button? And it's that big picture level that I think is the only way to approach the issue, is there free will or not? And when you look at how is it that each of us became who we are in this instant, it's there that you see no room for free will. When you look at how we are, nothing more or less than biology interacting with environment of 1 second ago, an hour ago, a century ago, all of that, that's all there is. And when you look at how all those different pieces of it meld into one, there's no room to shoehorn in a notion of free will. Which I guess brings me back to you asking me for my definition of free will, which is show me that a behavior has just occurred, a brain has just done something, and it has done it completely independent of the history of that brain. What other neurons were firing in the neighborhood 3 milliseconds ago? By whether you were tired or hungry or stressed or whatever that day, what your hormone levels were this morning, if you were traumatized a year ago, what your adolescence and childhood was like, were you being pickled in stress hormones from your mother when you were a fetus, what about your genes, what about the culture that shaped how your mother mothered you? Show me that all of those variables could be changed and you'd still do the exact same behavior. And for my money, you've just proven there's free will. And
what about the flip side of that all of those behaviors are the same, but you do a different behavior?
Well, what you get then is, let's look closer. And what science has consisted of is getting better and better magnifying glasses and saying something like, oh, I had no idea that like the bacterial makeup of your gut had something to do with behavior. That's a new trendy field, which I haven't followed too closely, but you do. Oh, I had no idea that had something to do with behavior. Oh, I had no idea that fetal environment had something to do with adult behavior. Oh, I had no, and at each one of those junctures, you get more insights as to, a whole additional set of gears that are relevant.
Two big questions come up for me. The first one has to do with some of the arguments that you were describing that others historically, philosophically, and biologically have made for a definition of free will. And it strikes me that they feel quite like dualistic, like that they require that there be a self and a brain as almost like two separate entities that are acting upon one another. And that's hard for me to grapple with because I just don't see them as being different. They are one and the same.
It's this folk belief that, yeah, you got your neurons and they're kind of squishy and yucky and you wouldn't want to like hold brain in your hands and that does all that neuron stuff. But somewhere inside there's this thing that you call me. And it's made of different stuff and it's in the brain, but it's not of the brain. And it could take advice from your neurons, but it's the thing that eventually makes the decision. It's medieval dualism. And that's sort of the emotional underpinning of most compatibilist philosophers who say, yeah, I'm willing to admit there's atoms and there's neurons and all of that, but somehow, here's how you can still pull free will out of the hat.
Right. I struggle, I think, with a different approach to this argument. And I'm sort of piecing it together as it's coming out of my mouth. So bear with me if it's not fully hatched. But I often, when I talk, for example, to individuals about evolution, and especially evolution via natural selection, one of these sort of fallacies or the biases in thinking that I often see is that we are able to utilize a hindsight bias. I'm at the end of this branching tree because I am a cross-section in time. And I look back. And when I look back, I see a series of things that occurred. And it feels like necessarily I was to evolve to become where I am, like that was always going to happen. But when you start at the beginning and you think about it in terms of opportunity or in terms of possibility, you see that there are hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of options. And it takes that sort of intentionality out of evolution via natural selection, right? That nothing was intended to become what it became. It happened because of a series of random just shit, just like random mutations and random pressures. And ultimately, this is just where we ended up. And so I sometimes I can't help but superimpose that on this free will argument that like we're looking at it through a biased lens because we can't not have hindsight.
Exactly.
So like at the beginning, it could have been a million different things, right? Like we could have gone left or right. Whether that's free will or not, whether you want to call that something else, random happenstance, I don't know. Sometimes I just worry that the word free will is so loaded that it's like it emotionally makes you push back.
Exactly. And I think sort of building on your key point there, that not only is there a problem that we have hindsight, but we have wildly distorted, uninformed, emotionally pickled hindsight when we try to make attributions to things. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's curious, or it's interesting to me because thinking about it from that perspective, that we are wildly biased when we look back at hindsight and we say, well, all things determined me to be this way. It feels like that's an argument against your argument, that's an argument for free will, but maybe it's not free will per se, as much as it's like free or random opportunity for all sorts of different inflection points and decision-making points. We just happen to make the ones that we made.
Yep. And you look at a lot of the compatibilist philosophers who try to still find free will somewhere in there. And often what they're doing is this sort of chronological trick of saying, okay, you don't have free will right now because it's an end product of this or that happened to you. But you had it in the past, and now you are being the person who was shaped by those decisions you made. And it's this belief that was never is, that the past tense was once the present tense and was exactly as mechanistic as it is now. Yeah, that's exactly one of the things that we have very distortive senses of our history, and we see agency where it wasn't, and we see meaning, and we are very loath to admit that, like, if freshman year of college, this attractive person had taken that other class and thus you decided to take that class too, in this feeble attempt to be noticed by them, you'd have a different major and you would now be an entomologist or God knows what. The vagaries of where the splits in the road occur could only lead to a conclusion that we're just the end products of luck.
And I feel like when it's framed in that way, that this is just, it's sort of like random luck and random biology and experience intertwining, it sits better. It's like philosophically, it sits better. And I'm just curious, where am I going with this? One of the sort of important points that's made in your book has to do with humility and empathy and these sort of humanistic ideals, that if we understand that most of our experiences in life, most of our, let's call them accomplishments or failures, most of our struggles and our triumphs are the culmination of just like, where we were fucking born, what the socioeconomic, stratification was, what country and under what geopolitical conflict, and the color of our skin, and, all of these different things that we had no control over, influence most of the outcomes, all of your argument, all of the outcomes that we're talking about. I'm deeply on board with that. But I think the question that comes to me, it sort of goes back to this, the point that I was making about, let's say, meaning. Whether I agree that there is no meaning and we have to create it ourselves, or like many of my religious patients, that there is meaning already kind of imbued into the world and it's their job to excavate it. For all intents and purposes, the outcome is the same, finding meaning. or meaning existing for these individuals. And so a big question that I'm sure you've grappled with and that I'm sure people have asked you time and time again is like, whether or not there is free will, does it fucking matter? Because is the outcome not the same? Like, what are the practical implications of this?
Oh, I think it's a universe of difference. Because if you really, truly believe there's no free will, there were nothing more or less than the biological and environmental luck that made us who we are in this instant, if you really, really believe that that's the case with everyone out there, praise and reward and blame and punishment make no sense whatsoever, never justified. Feeling a sense of entitlement, feeling a sense that you have earned anything, that you deserve anything more or less than the considerations given to some other person makes no sense at all. Hating somebody makes as little sense as hating a virus that is good at getting into our lungs. That none of this makes any sense. And criminal justice system, don't even say the word reform. The entire premise for it has to be trashed. At the same time, meritocracy. Don't even talk about reform there, about how your parents' wealth has way too much to do with which Ivy League school you. The whole system makes no sense at all. If you're really going to follow sort of the logic of this to its end, judgment, forgiveness, and any moment where you feel like your needs, you are entitled to have them considered any more than the needs of any other human, makes no sense. And that's the only logical sort of conclusion to reach. And it's also the only moral conclusion to reach. And I can function that way maybe 15 seconds every month.
Right. I was going to say.
It's really hard.
Like the moralistic side of it of really practicing humility and really practicing empathy and kind of seeing that true egalitarianism, that outcome of it is quite rosy and beautiful. But the alternative, which is that there is sort of no purpose to rehabilitation, that it undermines my entire field, right? I am a psychologist. I work with people and I've seen people who utilize very evidence-based approaches who better their lives, right? Who find more joy in their lives, who minimize or reduce their anxiety or their, whatever their mental illness is. And of course, I think you could always move the goalpost and say, yeah, but they were predetermined to want to go to a therapist and they were predetermined to want to do the work to do that. But when they do that, there is an outcome. There's an improvement for them.
Absolutely. And that's good fortune for your patients in that way. But what we have here is another one of the pitfalls where people see free will, or it's got to be there. And they say, if there's no free will, if everything's biologically determined, nothing can ever change. And that's obviously completely wrong. You build your calling on the notion that people can change. And we have endless dramatic examples of it, for better or worse, all of that. But the key clarification is we do not choose to change. We are changed by circumstance, and our reaction to that circumstance is filtered through what prior circumstances have made us into. I mean, you can have one patient who sits there and listens to you and takes it to heart and reflects and all of that. And another one who says, this is a waste of my time, a waste of my money. Or exactly what you allude to. Or you have two people go to the movies to see an inspiring film, and one person comes out of it changed. The person says, that's incredibly inspirational. I'm going to sign up for the Peace Corps right now. And the second person comes out changed by the experience. They say, that was like such emotionally manipulative garbage and the cinematography sucked. And I am going to change my behavior now. I'm going to go over to the front desk and demand my money back. And how they wind up being both of them were changed by this experience. Their behavior, they did something different than they would have had they not gone to the movie, but they were dramatically different because all the things they had no control over made them different people when they went in there. And that's exactly the case, as you outlined, whether somebody has the means to go and be aided by you, whether they have the reflective ability, whether they actually can see that stuff is not working for them, rather than just all their loved ones saying, you got to stop doing this, you need some help, whether they have the control to like do it week after, all of that. It's not by chance that only some people are helped by therapy. It's not by chance that any of these things happen. Things change, but it is because we are changed as a function of who we are at that moment.
And so, continuing down that sort of line of reasoning, I guess the other thing that comes up for me is this. You've sometimes heard people almost try to compare it to quantum mechanics, and I think that runs the risk of becoming very wooey and pseudoscientific very quickly. But this idea, right? Yeah, like what the bleep do we know? But this idea that by definition, the psychological experience of introspection and of self-reflection actually can affect us. Like it can change us psychologically. So it's not just that it's like this external force looking in, it's that there's actually this kind of interplay, and that the more reflection that we have, the more growth and change that we can have. And so this kind of question about whether or not you're predetermined to, let's say you're struggling with substance abuse, and there are two extreme outcomes that we can look at, and most people fall somewhere in between. One of them is that, you continue to fall off the wagon time and time again, or you never get back on. You continue to use, and your health deteriorates and degrades, and ultimately it's your demise. And the other extreme, let's say, is that you find yourself saying enough is enough. You go and you push yourself in rehab. And even though you fall off the wagon, you continue to be resilient. And ultimately you live a healthy, flourishing, functional life in spite of the fact that your biology or psychology has kind of predisposed you to this substance abuse problem. Okay, fine. We've got all of that sort of out there. There are some people in Camp A, there's some people in Camp B, most people are somewhere in between. But the question is the sort of hope for change, is the very concept philosophically of free will, a guiding force for the very people who find the ability to change? Is it a requisite that they believe in free will in order to make a positive change in their life? Because if they didn't, would they be more likely to say, well, fuck it, this is just the hand I was given?
Okay, well, that is like in some ways the ultimate, like, what do we do with all this question?
Right.
Reflection is a good thing. Our awareness of the gears underneath can be a very good thing. I mean, it is a great thing for interpersonal relationships that some people have truly learned that if you're tired and stressed, you're more likely to get into an argument with someone. And that, you've got biological insights into your action. When it comes to addiction, there's this huge problem that giving people a sense of efficacy seems to be so central to people being able to recover. And maybe the thing to do is emphasizing there that you're not choosing to change, you're being changed, that sort of thing. Let's put you in circumstances that will speak to your strengths that you already have in place, the strengths that you could summon to kind of resist or see that there's more to life than that, or I'm winging it here about addiction interventions. Maybe that's where you do it. What might be between the lines here is sometimes a belief that there's free will is kind of protective and it's kind of empowering. And a lot of evolutionary biologists, or some at least, have written about how if we're going to be a species that's smart enough to know that everyone who we love is going to die someday, the only way we could function as a species is we had to evolve a spectacular ability at self-deception. And that could be, that's like, how else? I mean, a zebra can get up in the morning without knowing its heart is going to stop beating someday. Yet we can, and most of the time we have to come up with all sorts of means to like not have that on our minds. We're a species that's very good at self-deception, and it's no wonder that when you manipulate people experimentally into feeling anxious, into an unsolvable problem, whatever, they resort to more external attributions of where causality is coming from and things of that sort. Yeah, we're pretty good at that. You know, the soundbite in depression research of like people with depression are often sadder but wiser. Depression as a disease of the failure of rationalizing away reality. So we're pretty good at ignoring that, and just made operational in areas like addiction stuff. Sometimes it's going to be a good thing to tell people that they can change. Um, when they fail to, you then have to deal with the fact that you've put a carpet under their feet of free will myths, and that you've now pulled the carpet out from under their feet. But when it works out fine, you know, a sense of efficacy at pulling off something meaningful and healing is a great thing.
You know, it's we're coming up towards, like, we're bumping up towards our hour, and I don't want to keep you too much longer, but that was a complex argument, and the one thing that kind of that sticks out for me is this idea that sort of the only way that we as a species can function under the constant threat of our obliteration, right? The fact that we will die one day is to come up with all of these psychological tricks, avoidance tricks. And I would argue that that is the most common way, but I would also argue that that is not a very healthy way, and that those who find oftentimes more depth of meaning in their life confront the fact that they're going to die, and instead of that putting them into a pit of nihilistic despair, see it as the sort of the two sides of the coin, right? The fact that I am going to one day die means that every moment that I am alive right now is much more meaningful to me, and that I am going to live my life to the fullest because I won't always have this life. Not the fact that I'm going to die means there's no point to everything. And I think with that kind of reasoning, I'm not sure quite how that maps onto the argument about free will, but I think it is important to push back that that is a very healthy and very human way that many people cope with this reality of existence.
And one could then say it's their good fortune that circumstance made them the sort of person that that's how they could respond to a crossroads like that. And we have contradictory myths about what a good death looks like. There's the rage against the dying at the lights. Wow, they fought a brave battle to the very end there. And then there's the one of they were at peace and acceptance, and they felt gratitude for the loved ones who were gathered around them, and this was a life well lived. And we've got very mixed feelings as to what to do with it. And, managing the terror pulls for a lot of different types of irrationality. And much of it has to do with, like, did you luck out and you're the sort of person who's not afraid of death because you're going to get to see all your loved ones who've already died and spend paradise with them? That's the sort of person circumstance made you into versus the, oh my God, it's going to end and there will have been no purpose. Yeah, it's a great, very important, very piercing arena in which to see how circumstances made each of us who we are, and thus how we're going to react to the ultimate circumstance.
I guess one of the big sort of questions that come out of the arguments that you frame, because on the one hand, you mentioned that the sort of only moralistic approach, once you have come to grips, let's say, with the claim, I don't want to say the fact, but the reality, as you put it, that there is no free will, is to sort of act accordingly. But one of those ways that you mentioned acting accordingly is, let's say, no rehabilitation. And so that becomes the question. And you even kind of jokingly said for a second, you can really only think that way for like 15 seconds at a time. Practically, really practically, so moving away from the theoretical and into the logistical, when one accepts, or let's say an entire culture or entire society accepts the concept of a lack of free will, what does that look like in a functioning, practicing society? Does it look like taking away opportunity for individuals to grow, to change, to better themselves?
No.
Okay.
Writing the book and believing there's no free will for all these decades, my view always was, well, that's depressing as hell, but, suck it up, and this is reality. And then having sort of a key realization somewhere in the panic starts of the final chapter of the book of, oh my God, I've got to get something better than this. If you're sitting there and you're finding existential despair at the notion that you didn't really earn being the CEO of your company, or you really didn't deserve the love you have found, or you didn't really, that, oh my God, this, like, none of this means anything, my accomplishments, if that's what you're doing, by definition, you're one of the lucky humans, because you are focusing on the fact that society works where you have been treated way better than average because of things you had no control over. But for most people, what their life experience has been is that they've been treated way worse than they should because of things they had no control over. And for most people, like, there's no free will. Instead of, oh my God, I didn't deserve my corner office, it's wonderfully liberating. And the reason why I think this is that every time society has managed to subtract out a perception of agency in what people do, it's become a nicer planet. It's a very, very good thing that at some point we figured out people don't have the power to control weather. And thus you don't burn the old lady at the edge of the hamlet as a witch for, like, causing the thunderstorm. Oh, it wasn't her fault. At some point, people figured out that epileptic seizures have something to do with, like, screwed up potassium channels rather than you've been sleeping with Satan. And the world is a more humane place. At some point, people figured out that schizophrenia is not caused by psychodynamically toxic mothers. At some point, people figured out that kids have trouble learning to read, not because they're lazy and unmotivated, but there's something screwy with, like, layer 3 of this part of their cortex, and they reverse letters and they have dyslexia. At some point, realized that obesity can be due to, like, having a messed up version of a gene for a leptin receptor, rather than this is someone with no self-control and they secretly hate themselves. At every one of these junctures, it's become a much more humane world. So amid, like, God knows how we can construct a world in which we, like, just keep pushing at those boundaries. What seems intuitively obvious now to us in terms of agency, oh, it's obvious some people can just get themselves to buckle down more than others. Some people just have more self-control. Some people have more backbone. That's a domain in which myths of free will are still very, very present. We don't believe people control the weather anymore, but most people believe intuitively that effort is made of something other than biology.
Right.
Get to the
Right. And
point
I think
where
they fall victim intuitively to that fundamental attribution error. They
exactly.
often think that it applies to me, but not to everybody else. They just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But I am a victim of circumstance.
Exactly, situational versus constitutional. And that's because we're people of our place and time. Um, when I was a 20-year-old, it seemed intuitively obvious to me that some people had trouble learning to read because they just didn't pay attention and they were not motivated and all of that. And my sense of what is intuitively obvious is different now, decades later, because, oh, they taught us something. Oh, like neural circuitry has something to do with whether or not you reverse B's and P's when you're learning how to read. And I have a different view. I'm not judgmental about that now. And if we were around 400 years ago, it might have seemed intuitively obvious to us that it's like reasonable for 4-year-olds, some 4-year-olds, to be worked to death in textile factories. And that doesn't seem intuitively obvious to us anymore now. And witchcraft doesn't seem that way either, but all sorts of things still do. And just put in the effort to see that if you could subtract out that realm of attribution that just seems so intuitively obvious now, intuition is a really lousy litmus test to run the world on because it is just a victim of the distortions of now and where you are. Push against that because every time we get more insight into, oh, I had no idea that's the actual cause of that, the world has become a more forgiving place, a less judgmental place, a more inclusive place. It's become a nicer world. It's very good that we don't burn old ladies at stakes anymore.
It's interesting because I think that ostensibly, superficially, when one first grapples with this argument that there is no free will and that all of these things are determined by circumstance, they can easily equate it with like an essentialist religious argument, right? Which is because in some ways it feels similar. Like, well, God says you get this and you get that, and we can't question God's will, and God's going to do this and God's going to kind of like, I have no free will because God has will. It seems very similar to I have no free will because the universe is, because all of these different kind of random happenstances. But the big difference, as you've just pointed out, is that view often leads downstream to very dangerous rhetoric around, let's say, eugenics, around genocide, around all of these atrocities. Well, these people just happen to be shitty, and these people just happen to be superior or better.
Yeah.
Whereas this view is wildly different because it's like, no, nobody is better and nobody is superior because it's all fucking random.
Yeah, exactly. And thus, you've got no grounds to judge anyone. And you got no grounds to kind of feel good about yourself because someone just said, wow, what a kind person you are helping that old lady across the street. Yeah, it's a radically different view. And, as I said, it's really, really tough to think that. I mean, I get pissed off if somebody cuts me off in traffic. And if somebody says, oh, nice shirt you're wearing, I at least briefly think I'm a better human than average as a result of that. But like when it really comes down to stuff that's important, we really have to think it through and see how much judging makes no sense and how much a sense that you deserve to be at the front of the line because you happen to turn out to have like more willpower than most people and thus you studied hard in college or any version of that, of how corrosive that is and how each time we get rid of that, things get better for all sorts of people whose lives are bad now, who are treated not well, who are ignored, who are viewed as peripheral, who are viewed as not worthy your consideration because of stuff they had nothing to do with.
Right. So not only does it sort of um, reinforce this non-judgmental, empathic stance towards others, but a humility towards ourselves, an ability towards ourselves to say, listen, like everything I have is not because I busted my ass to earn it, and everything they don't have is not because they constitutionally don't deserve it. It's really that in life, it's really a function of privilege. It's really recognizing privilege. And it's interesting that I believe that you can get to that place without the free will or lack of free will argument. And I still grapple with whether functionally it it matters, right? Like I wonder deeply if this is more of a philosophical kind of game than it is a practical understanding. Because I think that you can get to those places whether you believe in free will or whether you don't believe in free will. But I can also see the direct link between a lack of belief in free will and having those sort of moralistic stances. So I'm not mad at that at all.
You know, and that's great that one could get there from a different route. It just happens to be the one that seems scientifically unassailable to me. But hey, if people are nicer to each other, if it's because, I don't know, holding hands and singing about how you could make the world a better place, that could be a very good thing, or any version of this. Yeah, we are just the outcomes of chance. And if that's a bummer, it means you're one of the lucky ones. You have the privilege to be deflated by the fact that maybe you don't deserve your income, or maybe the fact that you are capable of love and are loved back is just, a byproduct of like your oxytocin receptors and the fact that you weren't beaten as a child. Maybe all of those, yeah, if that's deflating, you're one of the lucky ones. If instead you're one of the ones where, I don't know what the statistic is, but if you're born in poverty in this country, you're overwhelmingly likely to still be in it as an adult. That's just scratching the surface of getting volition and responsibility and blame and praise out of it is liberating.
Well, I have to admit, you've got me most of the way there. So I'm curious from I was just talking about this with another author. Art or science very often has two sides to it, right? It's like this deep, passionate self-expression and self-exploration, this deep, passionate curiosity, but also there is a consumer-facing side to this. Like you've grappled with these things for decades, but you did write them into a book with a cover price, a book that you anticipate others will read those words of. And so then it becomes a capitalistic exercise, a consumer exercise. It becomes not just about what you think and feel and believe, but about the argument that you make for others. So the question that I have for you is, how likely do you think you are to change hearts and minds with this book? And how interested are you in doing so? Are you hoping that people will read this and say, I am converted? Or are you hoping that they'll go, I never thought about this before. I will enter this into my kind of collective worldview?
Well, obviously, I would love the former. I say somewhere at various points in the book, I believe there's no free will whatsoever, but the purpose of this book is not to convince you that there's no free will whatsoever. It's at the very least to make you think that there's a lot less of it in realms where we make judgment and shift how you do things accordingly. I'll settle for that. I think that counts as like wildly wonderful if like you can sit and write some stupid book and it accomplishes something like that. I'll settle for that. That's fine.
I would agree that would be that is a huge win, and I think I'm probably heavily in that camp as well. So I've got to ask you, Robert. I told you I'd keep you for 45. I've kept you longer. I know you have a busy schedule. I close every episode asking my guests the same two questions. They're really big picture questions. They're questions I know you've grappled with personally, and I'm curious about your response to them. They have to do with the future, and so this is so fascinating. It's going to get very meta since we've been talking about free will this whole time. When you think about the future in whatever context feels relevant to you, this could be personal, it could be professional, it could be familial, communal, global, cosmic. Number one, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? The thing that really does concern you, the thing where you're struggling maybe with pessimism or even cynicism. And on the flip side of that, where do you find hope and optimism, and what are you truly looking forward to?
Well, I'll say, despite the eventually cheery message of the book, I am by nature wildly pessimistic. So the first question is very easy for me. Um, inequality. Inequality, whether in the form of like our conventional trendy notion of it in terms of socioeconomic inequality in our country, or inequality in terms of like, is your drinking water clean, and are you suffering from cerebral malaria because you got born into a part of the planet? Inequality and the pain and the anger and the chaos that will inevitably cause scares the crap out of me. Notions of like angry mobs fueled by injustice, but acting like frenzied humans at that point doesn't make me feel very good. In terms of optimism, yeah, we can change. There's people out there who used to be white supremacists. There's people out there who used to be slave owners and who became eventually major abolitionists. There's one very moving historical example of that. There's countries that used to be militaristic and now have gone centuries without a war. Yeah, change can happen, and change can reflect the fact that even though we by nature tend to view the world as made up of us and them, and to not be thrilled about the thems, it's very easy to manipulate us as to who counts as an us and who is a them, for better or worse. And for better, we see us's in all sorts of places where we used to not. So, a little bit of optimism there. I mean, I'm glad we're in this time and place with all of its terrifying, horrible things, rather than dealing with the bubonic plague in the 15th century, whenever Barbara Tuchman was writing about. So yeah, things get better, but it takes some doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you 100%. Well, gosh, I just want to thank you so much for, sharing your perspective with us, for the time, for the candor, and for the willingness for me to push back a bit. Everybody, the book is Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will by Dr. Robert M. Sapolsky. Robert, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me on. This was intensely interesting.
I'm so glad. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.